getting that morning writing time is really important for me because I feel like later parts of the day, I might be a little bit distracted or you're just thinking about other things. You have interruptions, you have emails, you have this. But I think, early in the mornings are great because then I can kind of get into a flow, right? And I have that period of time where, other people probably aren't awake. And I could just try to get things done during those couple of hours. And so that's, I think, like a typical morning for me.
Let's learn how our next guest get up, dress up, and show up on purpose. Enjoy the episode. Hello, morning enthusiasts. Welcome to the Best Morning Routine Ever podcast. I am your host, Dr. Lunid, and today it's an honor to introduce a very special guest to the show, Professor India Tusi. She is a professor of law at the India University Moore School of Law with a joint appointment at the Kinsey Institute. Her research examines, get this, racial and sexual hierarchies as they relate to policing, race, and gender. Her articles and essays have been published, and she has been, they're all forthcoming in the Harvard Law Review and NYU Review. And so it's an honor to have her on board because we want to talk about some of her work and how she got into it, but also let's talk about her success and her morning routine. So with no further ado, Professor India, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's an honor. It's a pleasure. Thank you again for taking the time. Today, we want to talk about your success and also how it began. So let's start there, right? Let's talk about your journey of why you decided law school and in that specific niche.
Sure. So I actually knew I wanted to be a lawyer when I was pretty young, when I was a child. I think my uncle asked me once when I was like 8 years old or something what I wanted to be. And I just said lawyer. I had no sense of what it even meant. He asked me if I like to argue. I said, no, I don't like to argue. That sounds terrible. But I think it's just something that kind of stuck with me. And then when I went to high school, I noticed some of the inequities that existed in society in terms of just the resources available to different high schools. I went to a school where it was mostly Black students, and I saw how aggressively policed people were. And I think at that point, I knew I was interested in maybe doing criminal law or focusing on that to really kind of respond to these inequities. I had always had a lot of negative interactions with the police and saw that, this just wasn't right. And I think when I went to college and eventually law school, I realized just how disproportionate things were and how discriminatory they were. And so from those personal experiences, I wanted to focus on, addressing some of these inequities. And I was a civil rights lawyer after law school. I worked at the ACLU. And then I also, worked for some judges who really kind of focused on taking a civil rights and human rights approach to the law.
Yeah, that's interesting. You said that it started so young and so early on for you. It was almost like it was innate, right? It was like a gift. I don't know the how, but I know I wanted to be a lawyer. And the things you talk about, they're real because I went to a high school where we had a metal detector. As opposed to my friends who live on the other side of town, they didn't have that issue. So and you sound like you went to a similar situation. Tell us what impact that has on a mentality of a young man, a young woman growing up who just turned to a teenager.
Yeah, I think it has a terrible impact. I went to a similar high school. We had metal detectors. We had what they call school resource officers, police in schools, basically. And, it switches you from being someone who's taken in education, who can aspire to anything, to knowing that at some point, a lot of these people are going to just end up in prisons, right? And it just shifts that frame of mind. And I think your mindset and the way your sense of belief really impacts the outcomes that you have in life, right? And so if you're getting that message, while you're in school, that could be really problematic. And it's it's not even effective to take that approach. Instead, people could be developing relationships with students and, making sure you have a, close relationship and connected to what's happening in the school student body if you're really concerned with safety, as opposed to treating students like criminals.
Yeah, and then it's almost like survival mode versus, as you
Mhm.
said, the ability to learn and knowing that what's the point? It's almost discouraging, right? Like,
Yeah,
what's the point of pursuing this education? What's the point of moving forward or getting good grades if you're so busy concerned with your safety, your survival? Um,
exactly. And you're told that, that you're limited in terms of what you're able to achieve, and
mhm,
the interesting thing is going from that environment, I went to college where it was, a predominantly white institution. The student backgrounds were like completely different from that when I was in high school. And, some of the stuff people were doing were similar, but despite that, there was still a sense of, even if I were to smoke marijuana once when I was, 18, that they could still go on and be doctors and lawyers, and it's not going to be this huge burden. Whereas, for someone who was in some of these other communities where I was in high school, you just end up in jail, and that's just your pipeline, right? And you get diverted away from opportunity.
mhm. And that has moved from just the walls of the school to our community to society now, right? In the last few years, we've seen it took a turn for the worse. Let's talk about that specifically because your expert is in racial and that aspect of it. So it goes from the school to our small community to now it's a global movement to actually see that take place in the last few years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, soon after I graduated from high school and college, there was this concern around this issue of the school to prison pipeline, how,
Mhm.
students, mostly students of color, were being pushed into the criminal system. And I think now, given all the events that have happened from Breonna Taylor's murder, George Floyd's death, there's a sense that this intense policing and criminalization is really harmful, that in fact it doesn't protect people and it exposes them to violence from the state. And so, really trying to re-examine how we treat everyone, ensure that we have equal opportunity for everyone, regardless of your skin color, I think is, getting a lot more attention than it has in the past. I think, with video footage and cell phone, really demonstrating and giving evidence of, some of the inequities that have always occurred, people are more open to, addressing some of these harms. And we've been seeing it recently.
Mm-hmm. And it's impacting everyone. It's
Hmm.
impacting everyone. We'd like to think it's just a small group. It's just a minority of people, but it is. It's an overall movement. And I have to say, I've been very, very pleased to see the involvement of the rest of the community joining in and supporting this cause, saying enough is enough. So that has really been the light to kind of help to bring to light what's been going on. I think Will Smith said racism has always been happening. Now we have an iPhone to shine a light on it, to be able to see it, to be able to actually bring publicize it almost in that way.
Absolutely. I think it's now impossible to kind of turn your eye away from it and avoid what we're seeing and what we're observing, right? And now we're just being forced to really confront some of these, issues that have long been a part of society.
Hmm. Yeah. So tell us about what are some racial and sexual hierarchies and how do they impact the lives of women?
Yeah, so, the way that I think about racial and sexual hierarchies is that they often intersect with each other to create unique harms for people. And so that's kind of building off of this idea of intersectionality, that, you can have racial discrimination that compounds with sexism. You might have a distinct form of discrimination that a group can experience, right? And so there might be particular prejudices around, Native American women and their mothering, right? That's particular to them as both a racialized group as well as, a sexual group. And then the same for Black women, right? A lot of the, some of the stereotypes about Black women, we saw it even, pretty recently with before Biden was selecting his Supreme Court pick, right? There was a lot of outcry when there was, some mention that it would be a Black woman. And then some people were suggesting that, how can we be sure that this person would be competent, right? How can we sure that this would be the right person? And I think that's a, perfect example of critiquing and, illustrating some of the stereotypes around Black women in particular, this presumption that they won't be competent and able to do the job, that there's something about being a Black woman that, you find really threatening. And, I think it can be a real challenge because we didn't see these same commentators making these remarks when President Trump pledged to nominate a woman to the Supreme Court. That was Amy Coney. It ended up being Amy Coney Barrett. We didn't see all this outcry that he was limiting the pool to just women, and that's just 50% of the population, because I think it was understood that it probably would be a white woman, and there was more of acceptance that white women could be competent, whereas, unfortunately, Black women are often against this perception that they're going to be incompetent. Now, given his pick, it's pretty clear that this person is extraordinarily, beyond competent and well qualified, but still, it was still this kind of racialized trope that played out in the media, and it affects, the everyday lives of, people who deal with these types of, stereotypes and these types of discrimination every day in so many different ways. I focus on the criminal system and, what the harms that come from policing, because that often can result in violence. And so, what I've observed is that, depending on who you are, your racial identity, your sexual identity, the type of policing you get is qualitatively different.
Mm-hmm.
I focus a lot on sex workers, and I found that, lighter skinned or whiter sex workers might receive a type of policing that's more benevolent or kinder, whereas, Blacker sex workers could be treated as more disposable, right, by the police and less, worthy of protection. And so that can create some harms.
Mm-hmm. And that is sad to hear, right? And just the example you said, not being competent enough, and then after being put in that role to see that you're surpassing that role. And so how does one push forward in that situation?
Well, I think being aware of the fact that there are these systemic barriers is important, right? Just be mentally prepared for that. But at the same time, continuing to do the work that you want to do, remaining committed and passionate, relying on mentors to help support you as you go along the way, relying on your peers and your friends to help you and support you as you're going along the way. That way you can also know that, your experience is not unique. One of the things I try to counsel law students about is, these are some of the barriers that they'll encounter even when they go into the legal profession, right? They might have partners who, make certain remarks or have certain assumptions about their abilities. And, it's kind of, it could be a little bit pessimistic and discouraging in some ways, but to know it in advance and kind of be prepared for it, and at the same time work with others to ensure that other people don't have these barriers, I think can be empowering in a way. And to know that, sometimes, women and people of color can be in these positions and wonder, did I really experience that? Maybe this was all in my head. Like, did they mean that? Or did they mean this? Maybe I'm just the one that's the problem here. And to know that, no, in fact, you're not the problem here. That should not have happened. People have these biases. Maybe you can reach out to other people who have had similar experiences. And that step alone, I think, could be pretty empowering, just to be able to acknowledge it. And then, once you get more empowered and you have the ability, trying to, ensure that these institutions don't remain that way, and that, other people don't have those same experiences, I think ends up being pretty important too.
Mm-hmm. What you just referred to is internalized racism too, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it's the norm, it's all we see, it's all we're exposed to, we begin to doubt ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We begin to believe that we're not competent, or we're not enough, or we can't do this, or we don't belong. What we like to call the imposter syndrome, right? And so it gets challenging. And so the effort is to really work on that mentally, that mindset that you talked about, to ensure that we don't fall into that, because that's exactly what it's how it's designed to do, to kind of break a man, break their mind, you break them essentially. And so to kind of release that barrier of internalizing what's happening, and let it stopping you in your track. It's almost like you have to push forward and be strong and continue to what you're doing. I like that you said continue to work on what you're passionate about, keep moving forward, and then the path will make a way for you. And I appreciate the honesty on that behalf.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And also, by sharing your experience or, finding community to support you
Yeah.
as you might have these experiences, I think could be really empowering and may allow you to eliminate some of these barriers. Even with this Supreme Court nominee, there's a group, She Will Rise, that organized to ensure that they would support a Black woman being nominated to the Supreme Court and other courts, and just working in community can actually be a really effective way to dismantle these systems so people don't have to continue to have these, barriers before them.
Yeah. Tell us about your latest publication.
Sure. So my latest publication is the book Policing Bodies, and it's about the policing of sex work in South Africa. And so in this book, I really examined the ways that policing is occurring. And I found that, if we are really concerned with the well-being of sex workers and just ensuring people are empowered and receive the services they need, that approach that is more like decriminalization actually would probably be the preferable approach, because once you introduce police into a situation where they're dealing with marginalized groups, that there is this risk of violence, right? And that's not, police officers are not there to be trained social workers. They're there to arrest people and to force that law in a pretty violent way. And, what I observed by working with the police and with sex workers were the ways that, violence could be reproduced when you have more policing, which might be counterintuitive for people because they expect police to protect people, when in fact, what I observed is that police often brought, violence to this community. And so, I kind of use this as an example of, pushing us to think of what are other ways to bring protections to people without relying on police, right? How can we really ensure that we can prevent harm without relying on just policing and criminalization? And I think, that's what we need to be discussing more in society. How do we, ensure that people have access to housing and having their basic needs met and just provide for society, as opposed to funding a lot of police and then, communities be really deprived.
How do we?
I think we fund communities and stop funding police as much as we do. I think that's really important. What was interesting was that, even though I interviewed a lot of police officers, almost all of them agreed that decriminalization would be preferable, which was interesting and something I wasn't expecting. They didn't think that they should be focusing so much on, enforcing sex work or dealing with sex work, right? And so I think we rely on police to do a lot of things in society that we really shouldn't be relying on them to do. Like, I think we could substantially, shrink police and then provide for community groups, provide for groups that are going to be focused on, like, sex workers, for example, or it could be people who are dealing with housing issues, mental health issues, whatever the case may be, and to really work in community with them. And I think that would actually bring a lot more protection to communities.
I do agree with you. I'm working on a project right now where we're not focusing on just putting a band-aid on social issues, right? We're
Mhm.
trying to eradicate them at the root cause. And that entails community efforts of, you can have 11,000 nonprofits trying, and 500 of them are trying to solve the same social issue. How do we collaborate? How do we come together to actually put our forces together so that we can provide the resources on every level for, say, the community, for that individual to end that social issue, instead of like just trying to fix it at the surface level. So I do agree and see where you're coming from in terms of actually helping the community out in that way versus just the criminalized, and having the cops just spend so much time just um, plucking away at it, but not really making a dent or solving
Mhm.
the issue.
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
Yeah, 100% agree with you on that. And I cannot imagine their work is easy. I cannot imagine the police officers are having a field day in this.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it could be a real waste of resources.
Absolutely. Tell us about your morning routine. How do you get up, dress up, and show up? How are you able to show up every day to do what you do?
Sure. So my morning routine starts pretty early in the morning. I'm naturally an early riser, but I also have three kids. And after having three kids, my morning started even earlier, and I decided I would just keep it super early because, it ended up being the one part of the day where I was just alone, where I had some alone time. And so it could start as early as like 4, or 5, but it could start around there is when my morning starts. And then, first thing I do, unfortunately, is look at my phone. I look at my phone, I look at my email. But after that, I work out. And so I just work out downstairs. I have a bike, and I do that for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. And that's just kind of, you know, my time to kind of think about my day, relax a little bit. I might watch something on YouTube and just kind of get myself prepared for the day. And after I work out, get dressed for the day, sometimes I might meditate and then, try to just jump into doing some writing in the morning time. And, after I do my writing, that's when I can actually like go to work and do the other stuff. But getting that morning writing time is really important for me because I feel like later parts of the day, I might be a little bit distracted or you're just thinking about other things. You have interruptions, you have emails, you have this. But I think, early in the mornings are great because then I can kind of get into a flow, right? I have that period of time where, other people probably aren't awake. And, I could just try to get things done during those couple of hours. And so that's, I think, like a typical morning for me.
There is power in those early hours when the
Mhm.
rest of the world is sleeping.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you do it for a couple of reasons, but one is like you want that solo time, that quiet time before your three kids are up, and they need your attention. They need you to get help them get ready for the day. So it's that self-awareness and that self-love, that self-care that actually motivates you to keep doing it, right? To keep waking up at that time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with you. Moving the body first thing in the morning does not only wakes you up, but it kind of gets the blood flow. It gets you thinking, and it energizes you. I find it if the more if I work out in the morning, there's more stamina, right? You notice you can go on longer.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Like I notice the difference when I work out in the morning and when I don't. And, it used to be that I would do it like a few days a week and that was my routine. Now I just do it every day because I realized if I interrupt it one day, then the next day I can find like a justification not to do it again. And so it just ended up being kind of like the standard thing I do every day. And it feels good.
yeah, and that's how you build habits. You don't want to skip a day. You want to keep at it because muscle memory kicks in.
Exactly.
Becomes automatic. So very nice. Tell us how can we connect with you? Where can we find you?
Sure. So you can connect with me on my website. So it's india2c.org and Tusi is THUSI. And there you can get my contact information. And I'm looking forward to hearing from folks.
Very nice. Thank you so much, India, for coming on the show. It has been a pleasure having you. Thank you for sharing your insight and your current work and your writings. I mean, I agree with you with how to solve criminalization and with how to tackle it. It the effective resources, putting them in the right places. And so, thank you for coming in and sharing with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Very nice.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please comment and tell us what was your favorite part, your favorite habit that you are going to try out for yourself today. Comment below. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. Until next time, I will see you at the top of your best morning routine ever. Stay blessed.